Hello. Today General Hospital will reveal the once warm and sacred atmosphere of the chapel in Port Charles had transformed into something eerily heavy and suffocating, like the weight in the air just before a violent summer storm. Rows of pews, delicately draped in ivory silk, lined the center aisle with solemn grace, creating a perfect setting for what was meant to be a holy celebration. The baptism of Daisy, the tiny child born of both Corinthos and Gilmore lineage, and more than that, a fragile emblem of hope that had managed to survive through rivers of pain, bloodshed, and loss. The community had gathered not just to witness a religious rite, but to affirm a new beginning for a family torn by darkness. Sasha, dressed in a simple, elegant cream-colored dress that clung gently to her delicate frame, now thinner and more fragile from months of grief and battle, moved slowly, almost reverently, up the steps of the chapel, each step taken as if she were ascending not toward salvation, but toward a fate she could not name. Her hands trembled ever so slightly, clasping Daisy's christening blanket, and though her face bore a gentle smile of maternal devotion, her eyes were shadowed with an unease she couldn't explain. It wasn't just the nerves of a godmother or guardian preparing for a child's baptism. It was something deeper. A gnawing sense in her chest that tonight's candlelight might not just illuminate new beginnings, but might instead cast the final flicker of her life. What Sasha did not know, what none of them knew, was that hidden in the quiet shadows of a side corridor, just beyond the flickering light of stained glass windows and murmured prayers, someone was waiting. No one present in that sanctuary. Not Sonny with his stone-cut vigilance, not Jason with his protective stillness, not Michael who stood in gentle proximity to the font, nor even Christina fidgeting with a silver bracelet, could have imagined that such tragedy would strike at such a sacred hour. The church had been filled with gentle music, whispered blessings, and the soft rustle of solemn ceremony. To everyone present, this was the beginning of peace, a symbolic washing away of chaos and trauma. For Sasha, it was a moment she believed could cleanse not just Daisy's soul but her own. A place where the memory of being institutionalized against her will, of being drugged, abandoned, manipulated, of dreams lost and years stolen, might finally be washed away with holy water and grace. She hoped to walk out of the church reborn. But fate had other plans. As the priest lifted the small gold cross, his lips forming Latin invocations of spiritual cleansing, a dry, piercing crack echoed from the rear of the chapel, unmistakable and out of place amid the sacred quiet. The entire congregation froze. It wasn't thunder. It wasn't a book falling. It was something far more sinister. By the time heads turned, Sasha's slender frame had already collapsed onto the cold stone floor, her body limp, lifeless, and still. The hem of her white dress was rapidly soaking in a dark crimson stain, her arms outstretched as though still reaching for Daisy. The scene was frozen in time, a sacred space desecrated by the suddenness of death, the scent of lilies now mixed with the sharp metallic tang of blood. Her body formed a brutal contrast to the carefully arranged symbols of purity and grace surrounding her. And yet Daisy remained blissfully unaware. Nestled in Jason's arms, the child stared curiously at the chaotic scene unfolding before her, as if it were a dream playing out far beyond her understanding. She gurgled softly, her small fingers reaching toward the air as if trying to grasp a strand of Sasha's hair that still lingered in the light. Jason held her tighter, instinctively turning his body slightly to shield her from the horror unfolding mere feet away. Michael was paralyzed, not speaking, not moving. Staring at Sasha's fallen figure as if time itself had stopped. Sonny surged forward, shouting orders with a commanding authority that cracked through the frozen air. Dante and Dex moved instantly, securing the building and directing guests to safety. But by then, it was already too late. Whoever had pulled the trigger, if a gun had even been involved, had vanished without a trace, like a phantom melted into the chapel's ancient stone. Security footage was quickly retrieved and reviewed in the sacristy, where the priest's vestments were still laid out on a table. The grainy footage revealed something shocking. Just minutes before the incident, a hooded figure had been seen slipping through the side entrance, moving silently toward the wings of the chapel. Upon closer inspection, the figure's gait and build bore an uncanny resemblance to Willow. And when the hood was briefly lifted, revealing a shadowed face, it was enough to trigger recognition. It was her. The very woman Michael had sworn was home at the Quartermain estate, resting with Wiley and Amelia. But if she had truly left the children asleep at home, why had she come to the church? And more importantly, why had she entered through a concealed corridor moments before Sasha's collapse? The questions multiplied rapidly, breeding theories and whispers that rippled through every corner of Port Charles. Why had Willow, once the picture of quiet righteousness, suddenly emerged in the periphery of a tragedy she had no reason to witness? Had she come out of guilt? Jealousy? Rage? Or worse, had she been a pawn for someone even more dangerous pulling the strings from the shadows? As the dust settled, and medics arrived to carry Sasha's lifeless body away from the blood-stained altar, no answers came. Only silence. Only grief. And a sense that Port Charles had once again been touched by a darkness it thought it had escaped. But in that silence, the echo of Daisy's innocent cooing became the only sound. A reminder that even as one life was extinguished, another still burned brightly, unaware of the legacy, the bloodline, and now the sorrow she had inherited. All suspicions quickly and almost violently converged on Sidwell, as if fate itself were peeling back a veil to reveal the figure lurking behind so many threads of darkness. There were simply too many signs, too many intricate ties that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence. This was not a man operating from the periphery, not a shadow whispering from afar. This was someone who had, time and again, left fingerprints in the ruins of Sasha's life. He had once followed her to the GH chapel in silence, a ghost lurking behind the pillars as she knelt to pray, her voice barely audible as she pleaded with a higher power for strength after discovering she was pregnant. He had not stepped forward to offer comfort, nor even confrontation, but instead remained in the shadows, observing her pain with the cold detachment of a man already plotting his next move. It had been Sidwell who initiated clandestine meetings with Sasha months prior, forcing her into vague, undisclosed deals that had left her rattled and fragile. Deals that Jason never fully understood but instinctively distrusted, because Jason, more than anyone, had learned to recognize the stench of danger, the sour aroma of blood that always seemed to cling to Sidwell's presence like a second skin. Jason may not have known the full extent of Sidwell's history with Sasha, but he knew enough to understand that wherever the man appeared, pain and destruction were never far behind. There was something almost ritualistic about the timing of Sidwell's appearances in Sasha's orbit, always emerging when she was most vulnerable, most alone, as if drawn to her despair like a predator circling wounded prey. What unsettled Jason and others even more was the fact that Sidwell had allegedly paid off a judge, a bribe that ensured custody of Wiley and Amelia would be granted to Michael. At first glance, it appeared to be a generous, if not misguided, act. But those who truly understood Sidwell's nature knew better. He was not a man who gave without expecting something in return, and certainly not someone who would involve himself in Corinthos family affairs out of altruism. No, this was calculated. If he had orchestrated a custody ruling in Michael's favor, it was because he stood to gain something from the outcome. And the most chilling possibility was that Sidwell had always planned for Sasha to be removed from the equation, permanently. Without her, Michael became more isolated, more vulnerable, more malleable. Without Sasha, Daisy no longer had a shield. What if Sidwell viewed Sasha not as a threat, but as collateral damage in a broader game of control? What if her death wasn't personal, but simply necessary, the price to pay for reshaping the power dynamics in Port Charles? In eliminating Sasha, Sidwell might have been attempting to create a vacuum, one he could quietly fill, manipulating Michael through legal levers and emotional vulnerabilities. Perhaps he believed that with Sasha gone, Daisy and Michael could be drawn into a world he could dominate through legal contracts, psychological coercion, or even fabricated loyalty. A man like Sidwell would not think in terms of morality or emotion. He would think in terms of leverage, of control, of opportunity, and Sasha, a woman with a heart too strong to be manipulated, had become a liability. no one yet knew the full truth. Not Jason, not Sonny, not even Michael, whose grief had folded in on itself like a black hole threatening to collapse everything around him. But one thing was clear: if Sasha truly was dead, if her body lying in the chapel was not just a tragedy, but a final, irreversible moment, then the entire chessboard of Port Charles had shifted. This was no longer just about custody battles or family feuds. This was war. A bloody, calculated declaration from an enemy who had chosen his target with surgical precision, knowing full well that his actions would ripple through every power structure in the city. But perhaps Sidwell had underestimated the resilience born of shared trauma. Perhaps he had misjudged the bond between Michael and Sonny, a bond that had been frayed but never fully severed. Perhaps he had failed to see the quiet, unwavering fury building in Jason, a man who had watched Sasha fight and claw her way back from the brink of madness, only to be cut down when she finally tasted peace. And perhaps, most fatally, Sidwell had not accounted for Daisy, not just a child, not just a pawn, but a symbol. A child who had now become the orphan of violence. Her presence would haunt every move made from here forward, a constant reminder of the price of silence, of inaction, of shadows left unchallenged. Even as investigators scrambled to uncover the truth, as the Corinthos family gathered in whispers to plan their next steps, and as Daisy cried out in confusion from her crib later that night, somewhere in the city a reckoning had begun. From the raw wounds of Sasha's fall, something else was awakening. Not just grief, not just vengeance, but resolve. This time, the blood would not be wiped away quietly. This time, Port Charles would bleed loudly. And Sidwell, whoever he truly was beneath the polished exterior, would learn that in trying to break a family, in silencing a mother, he had only sharpened the very sword that would be raised against him. Sasha's death was not merely the end of a woman who had endured more grief than most human hearts were built to contain. It was a seismic tremor that echoed through the very soul of Port Charles, a chilling reminder that darkness had returned, and this time, it had evolved. No longer crude or impulsive, it had become colder, more calculating, and dangerously patient. This was no longer the darkness of impulsive betrayal or isolated revenge. It was the darkness of long-planned destruction, one that slithered through hallways and whispered through courtroom corridors, infecting justice with corruption and twisting love into leverage. And with Sasha's last breath, that darkness had marked a new beginning, not just for those who plotted in shadows, but for those who would rise in fury and anguish to confront it. Daisy, innocent and unaware, would never remember the woman who fought through the depths of despair to hold her, love her, and protect her. She would never hear Sasha's lullabies, sung with the tremor of both fear and fierce hope. She would never feel the gentle grip of her mother's hand guiding her across the threshold of her first classroom. There would be no photographs of mother and daughter dancing barefoot in summer grass, no whispered bedtime promises, no late-night comfort when childhood nightmares came. The place in Daisy's life where Sasha should have been, steady, loving, always reaching, would forever remain hollow, a silence too deep to name. And yet, because of that void, because of that stolen presence, Daisy would become more than just a child left behind. She would become a symbol of resilience forged through tragedy, a living testament to the strength of a mother who had given everything to shield her from a fate she herself could not escape. Sasha's death, though devastating, was not an erasure. It was a legacy etched in defiance, a declaration that love, when tested, would bleed and die for its cause, but would never disappear. Sasha had not perished in vain. Her life, punctuated by unimaginable trials. Betrayal, manipulation, addiction, mental illness, public scrutiny, and devastating loss, had not ended in defeat. It had ended in sacrifice, and that distinction changed everything. Through Sasha, Port Charles had seen how a broken woman could rise time and again, how a heart shattered into pieces could still find the strength to love. Now, her absence would become a catalyst, an emotional ground zero from which new battles would be launched, not only to avenge her, but to protect the child she left behind. Daisy's very existence would haunt those who had tried to silence Sasha. Every breath the girl took would be a rejection of their cruelty, every milestone she reached a reminder that their darkness had not prevailed. What Sasha left behind was more than a daughter. She left behind a battleground. Her death would fracture alliances, ignite wars between old enemies, and spark vengeance in those who had once believed they had nothing left to lose. Jason, bound by guilt and a code he could never fully abandon, would feel the burden most heavily, the man who promised protection but failed to deliver it. Sonny, no stranger to death but unprepared for this one, would find his sense of control slipping through his fingers like ash. Michael, broken and teetering between fatherhood and fury, would have no choice but to confront the manipulations he once accepted. And those responsible, whether Sidwell or others still in the shadows, would face a reckoning far more personal and ruthless than they had anticipated. But even as vengeance brewed and justice was planned in whispered corners and candlelit rooms, the true weight of Sasha's passing would be carried by Daisy. In her laughter, there would be echoes of a woman who fought to survive. In her tears, the pain of generations burned into memory. And as she grew, others would tell her stories, not just of tragedy, but of triumph through suffering, of a mother who never gave up, even when the world tried to bury her again and again. The world would teach her that her mother died a victim. But those who truly knew Sasha would ensure she learned something more, that her mother also died a warrior. And so, the light Sasha once carried, dimmed by trauma but never extinguished, would continue to burn in the most unlikely vessel, a child too young to understand grief, but destined to one day feel its full weight. That light would not be clean or easy. It would flicker, falter, and rage. But it would endure. Because Sasha's love had not been soft or fragile. It had been fierce. And in her final act, dying with her eyes fixed on the child she loved, she transformed that love into something immortal. A light no darkness, no matter how cunning or brutal, could ever extinguish. And while Port Charles descended into days of mourning, a city once hardened by loss now stunned into silence by the weight of one more tragedy, another goodbye unfolded quietly, without fanfare, beneath the surface of the screen. Sophia, the actress whose soul had given shape, breath, and heartbreak to Sasha for years, exited not with headlines or farewell montages, but with a final performance that pierced deeper than any scripted goodbye could have. There was no press release, no official send-off, no dramatic curtain call. Instead, what lingered in the hearts of viewers was a single, haunting image. Sasha, collapsed at the altar during her daughter's baptism, the delicate curve of her fingers still loosely curled around the engraved bracelet that bore the name, Daisy. A mother's grip, interrupted mid-prayer, mid-hope, mid-love, a gesture that said everything without uttering a word. It was not merely a death scene. It was a requiem. The camera had captured more than just Sasha's final breath, it had captured a legacy. As the soft light filtered through the stained glass windows above, the focus narrowed on her eyes, once filled with a flickering fight for survival, now dimming not with defeat, but with peace. Not the peace of resolution, but the peace that comes from knowing she had given everything she could. Her eyes did not close in agony, nor in fear. They closed with quiet finality, the kind that speaks to a soul that has run its course through hell and fire, and now, finally, finds rest. Sophia's departure was not marked by grand speeches or emotional backstage goodbyes caught on social media. It was, in many ways, more powerful than that. It was embedded in the character's last frame, a closing shot that said what no line of dialogue ever could. Sasha's final moments were not loud. They were devastating in their stillness. There was no music swell, no last word, just the image of a woman who had lived and lost more than most characters ever dared to. A woman who was so much more than her traumas, so much more than her breakdowns and redemptions. She was raw, flawed, complex, and beautifully human. And in that final image, she transcended fiction. For the audience who had followed her story, from her earliest manipulations and unravelings, through her grief-stricken spirals, public humiliations, staggering recoveries, and fragile joys, the goodbye felt intimate. There was a collective breath held in living rooms across the world as that final scene aired. The realization that it was not just Sasha they were saying goodbye to, but the actress who had poured her heart into making that character more than ink on a script. Sophia had not just played Sasha, she had inhabited her pain, her courage, her contradictions. And she had done so with a quiet brilliance that never asked for applause, only understanding.